sponsored by the National Catholic Reporter. I'm Heidi Schlump, NCR's executive editor. I'm filling in for Olga Segura, our opinion editor, who was supposed to moderate this panel, but who's having a few technical difficulties. She may be joining us in a few minutes. So in addition to myself, we also have a guest today, and I'm excited to say Bishop John Stowe of Lexington, Kentucky is here with us. Bishop Stowe was ordained a Franciscan priest in 1995, and after serving as a pastor and in other capacities in Texas, he was tapped by Pope Francis to lead the Lexington Diocese in 2015. So he is also the Episcopal moderator of Pax Christi, and I know Pax Christi shared this event on their social media, so welcome to some Pax Christi viewers, hopefully. And welcome to you, Bishop John.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Heidi.
Great. Well, this really is a historic time and a crazy news week for all of us who are in the media. We want to remind our viewers and listeners that this is an interactive event. So if you have questions for either me or for Bishop John, we'll be taking those shortly after we have our conversation. We plan to talk for about 15 minutes or so and then move to audience questions. So a couple weeks ago, NCR launched a series of essays in which Catholic leaders were giving advice to President-elect Biden on specific policies that we hope he'll address in his first 100 days. And Bishop John was kind enough to write one of those essays. So we want to talk about that series, but first, given the historic nature of yesterday's impeachment vote, and that was following the violence at the Capitol on January 6th, we wanted to see if if you wanted to comment on any of that, and I can give my opinions as well. Bishop John?
Sure. Thank you, Heidi. And first, let me congratulate you on a great series on the first 100 days of Biden's term and what Catholic social teaching would look for and hope for in that. And I think we saw those articles dovetail pretty well and some common themes. When we look at the events since January 6th, it's just heartbreaking, angering. There's a whole flood of emotions that come when we think about what happened at the Capitol. And if we think about what can the church do in the midst of this, I think it really calls us to more authenticity. And by that, I mean, in the pulpits, we have to preach the nonviolence of the gospel message. I don't think we do that enough, and too many Christians find a militaristic response, not only in the national and global sense, but even these so-called militias trying to claim some connection to Christianity. I don't think we hear enough about the nonviolence of Christ's teaching in the gospel. Secondly, I think as a Catholic Church especially, we have to follow Pope Francis's lead, and we have our own American approach to this going back to Cardinal Bernardine about looking at all the life issues together. And how sad it is for us that we could support a president who has shown such manifest disregard for the dignity of the human person, no interest whatsoever in the common good, and yet we hold him up because of his opposition to abortion. How could we sell out everything based on one issue, whether you call it the preeminent issue or not? Yes, human life is sacred, and yes, it's sacred from the moment of conception. No argument within the church about that. But that can't be the only thing, and Pope Francis shows us how it's all interconnected. And a disposable approach to human life in the womb is connected to a disposable approach to life of migrants, a disposable approach to the life of refugees, a disposable approach to those on death row, a disposable approach to those who would suffer from climate change. It's all interconnected, and I think we have to do a better job teaching that. When it comes to elections, we've been typically, and for good reason, as a bishops' conference, focused on issues. But I think Bishop McElroy from San Diego has taught us the importance this year of focusing on the character of the person, because you're electing a person who represents the country, who is the head of state, who is our national spokesperson on the global scene. And our teaching is so rooted in the dignity of the human person and the common good, and to have our main leader negligent in both of those areas, it should be shocking that he had so much support from within Catholic communities. And I think Father Brian Massingill from Fordham University said it very bluntly, but very accurately when he said that mob at the Capitol shows we would rather have a white dictator. Some of us would rather have a white dictator than a multicultural democracy. If that's not a moment for us to do self-reflection and really think about what we're teaching and how we're living the values of our faith, I don't know what is. And of course, we have a lot of praying to do, praying for the new president, praying for our own healing as a nation, praying for greater embrace of justice, praying for what Pope Francis teaches us, that we are one human family, and we have so much to do.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, Bishop John. I think a number of Catholics were concerned that they weren't hearing enough from our leaders, given the fact that some who were storming the Capitol were claiming the mantle of Christianity. You mentioned the importance of life issues, and of course, people died as a result of that violence. And mentioning the death penalty, the execution this week, and the others that are scheduled for tonight and tomorrow. We did an editorial at NCR supporting impeachment. We said we had a moral obligation, given the fact that the current president did help incite the violence that happened. And we also did an editorial talking about the complicity of some in our church. So those who have insisted on being apologists for Trump, I think, have some responsibility. And I'm grateful that it seems that more and more Catholics are speaking out about that, and seeing the danger of some of those in our church, individuals, groups, or even so-called media. We talked a lot about the common good. That's what we titled our series of Catholic advice to President-elect Biden, Building a Common Future, which is a phrase we took from Pope Francis' encyclical Fratelli Tutti. So we decided, or we thought it wouldn't be as crazy in January, and we would look towards the future and ask a number of essayists to tell us, to pick an issue and tell us what Catholic social teaching, what papal teaching, what our tradition, the Gospels, Jesus might say about that issue. And we have commissioned enough of them that we're going to be running them the entire month of January, so 4-week series. In my column that's posted today on our website, I wrote about how we plan to cover a Biden administration. Of course, we're excited and somewhat proud that our second Catholic president in our country's history is about to be to assume leadership of the country, but he doesn't get a pass because he is a Catholic. And we plan to hold him accountable, and we decided to give a running start with that by this series of essays. So, Bishop John, your essay, which ran this past Monday, and the entire series is available at ncronline.org, talked about why the Biden administration must include the rural poor in his policies. So a lot has been said about how disaffected many rural Americans are. What are you calling on the Biden administration to do, and why do you think this is such an important issue?
Sure. I think the first step for the Biden administration to do is listen to the people who are living in poverty themselves in rural areas, and to hear what their concerns are. Everything is not like the cities. And, 4 years ago, right after Trump was elected, there was a lot of hand-wringing about who were the supporters of Trump, what were the swaths of the country that supported him, and how we could do more to understand what their issues were. Because, for example, where I live, and a big part of my diocese is coal country. And even though all of the evidence shows that coal is not the energy of the future, it's not economic to produce anymore, it's not easily sold with the availability of natural gas and the movement towards green energy, yet a candidate could come in and promise to bring back coal. And of course, there is less coal being mined in Kentucky than before Trump was president. He makes lots of empty promises, but he connected with people in a way that Hillary Clinton couldn't connect with people. And I think Joe Biden has more credibility because of his own blue-collar background, because of the family story that he tells, because he is a person, a very evidently a faithful person, that he can connect with people more, and he's an empathetic person. but how so many people were able to align themselves in areas where they depend on government support, where they depend on government investment in retraining people for jobs, where they depend on and have the resources to promote much more green energy, how all that could be ignored and people still vote for somebody that they thought represented them. I think we need to get to the bottom of that somehow. And I think listening is going to be very important. So Biden has said consistently that he wants to be the president for all Americans. And I take him very much at his word at that. And I think from people who know him, he's genuine in that. And he's demonstrated an ability to work across the aisle and to do those kind of things that are important. But it can't just be on the policy level. It's really got to be an investment in knowing what people's needs are. And given the events of the past week, to go back there for a second, working for unity can't just paper over everything that has happened. It's going to also involve real investigation and a real direct look at what's gone on and what went wrong, and bringing some attempt at justice for what has happened. Now, the areas of Appalachia and all of the areas of the rural parts of our country where people suffer from poverty, it's very easy to buy into the narrative that they're poor because they don't work, they're poor because they're dependent on the government, they're poor because this, that, or the other. When a close look at the demographics, there's so little opportunities. There are schools that are falling behind. It's hard to recruit teachers for rural places. It's hard to find health care in so much of rural America. The food deserts exist, ironically, in places where food is grown but are not so healthy. Good food is not so easily obtained by people. All of these are compounding factors. And then you add the drug addiction, that relates from hopelessness. You find cyclic poverty, just as you would find in urban settings where generation after generation experiences the consequences of poverty, like drug addiction, like incarceration, and there becomes a trap where there's no way out. So there's got to be a lot more attention paid to rural America, and it starts with looking at the inhabitants of rural America as human beings, and those who suffer from poverty have different needs than those in the cities.
Well, thank you for that. Just a reminder to those who are listening or watching, if you would like to throw your hat in the ring with some questions, we'll be taking those in the comments, especially if you're watching on YouTube. We can monitor the comments and questions, and hopefully we can address those. I have a follow-up question for you, Bishop John. You call for listening to people in rural areas. You're someone who I suspect, knowing your pastoral style, has done a lot of listening. And in addition to the economic issues, what are you hearing? I think there's some concern that what rural people would say would be a concern about their loss of their way of life, the values that they've held, and perhaps with many of them being white who live in rural areas, some issues around immigration, people of color, things like that. But what are you hearing, and how do you think you can go forward given what you've heard?
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas where stereotypes break down quite a bit. You know, I'm thinking of a native of Pike County, one of our most rural mountainous counties in Kentucky, who said he never saw racial prejudice until he came to Lexington, until he came to the big city. Part of it was because what they took as normal was the segregation and other realities that were part of life there. But he grew up playing with African American kids and being part of friendships with them. So it was it's surprising. And also the immigrants. You know, our church is an immigrant church, and we find immigrant communities all over, even the Appalachian region. So one of the first confirmations I did 5 years ago when I came to this diocese, I was surprised to find that only one of the kids in the class was born in the United States. I had Vietnamese, I had Filipino, I had Mexican and Brazilian kids in that class, which was quite surprising for me. Another congregation that we have in our diocese where people come from at least 3 different backgrounds, completely different from what you consider the Appalachian background, and they seem to get along well. Nonetheless, there is a history of racism. There is a history, as it is throughout the South and throughout the whole country, for that matter, and it has to be addressed. But when people think they're losing their identity and their way of life, I think they need a forum to hear that, but then also to be challenged in what exactly does that mean? Is that the dependence on coal? Is that the dependence on the extractive industry? Is that what does it mean that we're losing a way of life? Is it losing the agricultural lifestyle? So again, it's where listening comes in handy. And I think Nuns on the Bus gave us a good example of how you do that kind of listening. The Catholic Committee on Appalachia, the Catholic Committee of Appalachia, before writing their pastoral letter in 2015, did a lot of listening sessions and heard from voices that might be surprising in the ways that they reflect on Appalachian living and rural living.
Good point, Father John. I too was following some of the Nuns on the Bus, their tour where they went around to rural areas. This was before the pandemic, and did listening sessions. And I remember Sister Simone Campbell saying that she was very surprised by much of what she heard. It seems like the church would be a good institution to facilitate and model some of that listening that you talked about, but then also some of that challenging. We have a question from one of our viewers who's asking you, how do you dialogue with your fellow bishops, some of whom may be rather vocal on social media when it comes to certain issues? And specifically, this person is mentioning Bishop Strickland of Tyler, Texas, or Archbishop Vigano, who of course have been kind of supporters of many of the right-wing people in the church. And this person thanks you for your witness and your time. How would you answer that?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, but I think when we talk about dialogue, there also has to be the conditions for dialogue. We want to be open to every perspective and every viewpoint, but to really have dialogue, both sides have to be open to other perspectives and other viewpoints. And I'm sorry to say, but I think Archbishop Vigano represents so much of what's been wrong with the church in its relationship to the Trump administration, because they buy into crazy theories. They use alternative facts. The things that he's addressing sometimes aren't even based in reality. And they are based in a very narrow understanding of what the church is about. Bishop Strickland, I presume he is trying to teach from his own conscience, and I respect and honor his approach and the importance of the sanctity of life, but he should recognize when a former nuncio goes against the Holy Father, that's not a good sign for the unity of the church. And I don't know how you enter into dialogue. I don't think you can enter into dialogue until there's some agreed upon facts. So maybe the pre-step is, how do we chip away at these barriers and find some common ground just to begin a dialogue. Dialogue also requires, mutual respect, or at least that should be the outcome of it.
We have a person asking about that. How could people in the pews contribute to furthering some sort of open dialogue with, their fellow Catholics and their fellow citizens? Do you have any suggestions about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not at all different from what we're talking about, the dialogue among bishops. First of all, there's got to be some willingness to open oneself to the truth. Part of the pastoral planning for the Diocese of Lexington talks about teaching methods for dialogue and for discernment. I think those are so important things that we don't necessarily have in our digitized culture. Pope Francis talks about you can't have an encounter when you're using a device with an on and off switch. And because we've been dependent on that, as we are right at this moment with the pandemic, we've been doing so many things through electronic media, we also can select which voices we're hearing and which voices we're not. I think the first thing is to try to read something from a different perspective, and then use a filter and discern where is the truth in what's being said, and what have they taught me that I don't already know, or where have they challenged my presuppositions. I certainly have presuppositions as well that need to be challenged, but we can't get into the what some have described as the rabbit hole of chasing after and defending things that can't be defended, and going through down this path of false things being presented as truths.
What a great suggestion. And of course, as a journalist, I read across the spectrum every day. And I encourage people who maybe don't regularly read NCR to read NCR to be challenged. And there certainly is a plethora of Catholic voices that represent other opinions out there that people could pay attention to. And I like what I heard you say about trying to listen for what is the truth there and what are you hearing that strikes you. One person is asking a question that they're hoping to have a Healing Our Community forum in their parish to grow into courageous conversations, and was asking for moderator prompts or general questions. It seems like that might be a good answer there. What you said about reading other people's voices and listening. Any other suggestions?
Well, I hope they would give some time after the election, after the impeachment, after the inauguration of a new president. I hope they would give some time for things to cool down before jumping into that. I just find myself, my own blood pressure, my own the sense of agitation, it comes to the fore so easily when I hear things that I vehemently disagree with. And it can be hard to enter into a real dialogue until we have the calm. So if you're going to do a forum like that, make sure it's preceded by prayer. Make sure you have some fair moderators who are not as invested in being right and as invested in getting their point of view across, but also are willing to challenge when people just throw things out there that are patently untrue.
Yeah, you're right. It's going to be still a very heated next couple of days. There are threats about demonstrations and possibly violence in some of our state capitals. And I think everybody is nervous as we move towards the inauguration next Wednesday. Another questioner has brought up the issue of abortion. Of course, many in the church disagree with the Democratic Party's position on abortion, and specifically with Biden, who has even expanded some of his move towards abortion rights. We have part of this series, we do have a piece that is directly addressing pro-life issues, specifically abortion, from Gloria Purvis, who is a former radio host with EWTN. And we have Sister Helen Prejean writing about the death penalty, another important life issue. So look for those to come in the future. But the person is asking, how do we move beyond just thinking of Biden as this abortion supporter, or how can we deal with that issue with this Catholic president?
Well, I think it goes back to really getting to the heart of what Catholic social teaching is, and it's the dignity of the human person. Now, it's because of our belief in the dignity of the human person that we can't approve, we can't tolerate, we can't be in agreement with the destruction of a child in the womb or a person on death row. It's the same respect for the dignity of the human person. So while we might not agree with Joe Biden on the legality of abortion, I think he has lots of areas of his life and policy where he emphasizes an importance of the dignity of the human person. I also think the president-elect expects to be challenged by his own church on that issue. He has been for years, and he comes from a mind frame where he can understand the importance of making that challenge. It's also, we use some, I think, heightened or exaggerated language to call Biden an abortionist, for example. I don't think there's any evidence that he goes out encouraging women to have abortions. I don't think there's any evidence that he goes out and passes out pamphlets for abortion clinics. I don't think there's any evidence that he has personally engaged in trying to get somebody to have an abortion. So we should be careful with our language. There is a difference, and please don't take me out of context and say that I'm in favor of legalized abortion, but there is a difference in respecting an established law of the land, even one that we disagree with, as opposed to actively promoting something that we know is an intrinsic evil. So our moral life is complex. We don't have there's some issues we definitely have a black and white approach to, but even within them, there are so many nuances. And what Pope Francis keeps calling us to discernment is primarily about people, not about issues. So how do we make alternatives to abortion more attractive for those who find themselves with unwanted pregnancies? How do we demonstrate a completely pro-life attitude? I think is going to be our challenge. And I think there's some areas for agreement with President Biden.
Yeah, and this is the issue that has so divided our church and seems to have led a number of Catholics and other Christians to their support of Donald Trump. We have a piece today written by two therapists and counselors, a sister and a priest, who talk about what psychologically is happening both with Trump but also with people who have followed him under the guise of it being about pro-life issues. So I think this is going to be the issue that's going to continue to challenge us. Let me just, we've got to catch up.
Mention that, you know, there are fonts of Catholic media or so-called Catholic media that has way too much influence. There are blog sites and there are networks like EWTN that only teach about abortion, that do not present an entire view of the sanctity of human life, and have even been hostile towards the teachings of Pope Francis. Well, that's not going to help with unity. That's not going to help us have a united approach even to our own issues.
Yes. So if there's any common theme in the essays that are part of this series, this Building a Common Future, which we're calling also Catholic Advice to President-elect Biden in for his first 100 days, it is this idea of the common good, which comes from Catholic social teaching, and common good meaning that we have to look at all life, and this includes unborn life in the womb, but obviously many other people whose lives were threatened, physically and otherwise under the Trump administration. So a number of these essays address economic issues, as yours did, for example, with the rural poor, but also workers and union members and immigrants and people who are incarcerated or people of color. So what I'm struck by as I read these essays and prepare them for publication, we have one running each day, is that there's so much work to do, in part because the policies of the last 4 years have not paid attention to so many of these suffering people. So we're hoping that this is something that Biden can dive right into. But of course, now we're seeing with the impeachment trial, if it were to happen in the Senate, he may get distracted, or at least senators may be distracted by that. How can we move forward after the Trump presidency? He seems to suck the air out of the room or continue to be in the news headlines. And how can we focus on moving forward? Do you have any advice about that, Bishop John?
Well, combining those last couple of questions, President-elect Biden has made some promises about his first days in office, and I think we hold him to accountability for that. Changes on immigration, changes about the admittance of refugees, entering the Paris Climate Accords, renewing the anti-nuclear deal with Iran. You know, those are life issues as well. How we treat the immigrant and the stranger, how we receive people who are fleeing from certain death, starvation, poverty, or war in different parts of the world. When we are in a land of abundance that has traditionally been the welcoming place for so many in the world. How we treat the young people that were raised in this country and don't know their native homeland and live for so long now with the threat of deportation and had their studies, their careers, their futures put on hold. All of those things can be enacted right away because they were presidential orders. They were administrative. They were not legal processes. So I think there's quite a bit that he can do, and focusing on the environment once again. We had a president the last 4 years that did everything possible to destroy the Environmental Protection Agency, to increase fossil fuel consumption and contribute to the destruction of the environment. That has to be reined in quickly.
Great, and you're giving me hope, reminding me of all the things that could be accomplished very quickly and make a real change. Do you have any? We're coming to the end of our time here, and do you have any other final comments?
Well, I am hopeful in these days, but I also know the amount of work that has to be done. It's just, when we saw what happened at the Capitol, and to think that 74 million people supported Trump and feel like he was cheated out of something, to reestablish truth, to have criterion for civility, what about our public discourse? A president that has no problem using pejorative language to talk about individuals, whether they're lawmakers or whether they're immigrants, whether they're people of color or whomever. And we just accepted that as normal. We accepted that as normal. I'm convinced that President Biden will remind us what normalcy looks like, what leadership looks like, what empathy looks like, what it means to have somebody who can truly lead us in ways of justice and peace.
Well, thank you for that. And I know I'm seeing in the comments many thanks to you for you also modeling your leadership in our church and in this conversation with your own civility and compassion. I want to thank you again for joining us, and a special thanks to our behind the scenes folks, Stephanie Yeagle and Brittany Wilmus. I know we did have some problems with the streaming towards Facebook, but it will be posted on our YouTube channel and as well at ncronline.org. You can also find the entire Building Our Common Future series that we've been talking about at ncronline.org, and you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks so much again, Bishop John, and we look forward to talking to you again
soon. Good to be with you, and good job on the series.